So today after leaving class, you head home and you think about your plans for the night. A police officer sees you and stops you. He asks you what you're doing, and you respond and tell him you're heading home. The police officer has been given a description earlier in the day of a person who robbed a store. He wants to take you to the station to identify you and see, your measurements and different things. You haven't done anything wrong, so you think, well, okay, I'll go. So you go to the station, and the officer measures you, and your measurements match. He does your body, your arms, your height, your legs, and even your skull. You match the measurements of a man who recently got out of jail for rape and is currently wanted in 10 states. They handcuff you right then and there. You plead your innocence, and when you come up with a birth certificate, but the measurements tell a different story, so you're off to jail. You have just been wrongly identified as a person who committed a terrible crime. Because the measurements of your body match those of the real person who committed the crime. This could have been the unfortunate case of a man named Will West, if fingerprints had not been previously discovered. Today we're going to embark on a journey through the world of basic fingerprint identification. On our journey, we're going to explore a brief history of how fingerprint identification has benefited our society over the years, by giving you an example of a man who, without fingerprints, would have been wrongly identified. Then we're off to learn about the specific points of minutiae used in identifying fingerprints. And finally, by the end of our journey, we will understand why fingerprint identification is so important in helping society maintain a sense of personal safety. I'm going to guide you through the process of fingerprint identification by looking at the details of a fingerprint. These details are called Galton's details. I first learned about Galton fingerprint identification from the Forensic Science Academy I attended. How many of you have watched a crime show at one point in your life and were curious to know how fingerprint identification works? Really? Well, today I'm going to show you some brief steps on how this process is done. The first thing I'm going to talk about is some of the history of this kind of identification. From our past mistakes, we've come up with more efficient ways of identifying someone. In the 1870s, an anthropologist named Alphonse Bertillon devised a system to measure and record the dimensions of certain bony body parts, namely the head, the arms, and the legs. See that? The Bertillon system was proven inefficient when a man named Will West entered Leavenworth Prison in 1903. Will denied ever being there before, but the record clerk measured him anyway. And sure enough, when the clerk referred to the formula derived from West Bertillon's measurements, he located the file of one William West, whose measurements and photo were identical to the new prisoner. But when the clerk turned over William West's record card, he found that it was that of a man already in the penitentiary serving a life sentence for murder. These men are actually not even related, so it's kind of unusual. Subsequently, the fingerprints of Will West and William West were impressed and compared. The patterns bore no resemblance. This case shows the value of fingerprints for every person. Now that we know a little bit about the history of fingerprint identification, let's look at how the process works. These are the three basic types of fingerprint. You have the loop, the arch, and the whorl. The loop, right here, is the most common type of fingerprint. The arch is the second most common, and the whorl is the least common type of fingerprint. Okay, next, this is a fingerprint, and what you would start with are the type lines. These beginning lines here are type lines. That's a type line, and that's a type line. And you would follow this canal up to the very first ridge, which is your delta, that's your starting point. And then you would follow the invisible line all the way up to the core, which is here. And each line that crosses that would be each ridge that you would count. So, for example, the first one is a short ridge, and the second one is a bifurcation, because the line, there's actually two lines, and they go into one line. They go down into one line. You have all the different labeling for each ridge on the side right here. So once you have the number, this one is 25. Once you have the number, you're going to use your classification chart. This one is for loops only, though. They have another one for whorls, different ones. Okay. And depending on the finger, the type of finger, the number indicates the number of ridges in the print, and depending on the finger that it was taken from, that determines the letter of the corresponding ridge count. Anyway, there's a lot more to this process to get a full formula for your print, but I wanted to give you the basic idea of how it works. Okay. After understanding this process and how it works, let's talk about how it helps you as an individual feel safer in society. Intense studies throughout history have shown that no one else has your fingerprints or will ever have your fingerprints. Fingerprint identification uses 12 points of minutia or details to identify you. So each one of the details, each one of the ridges, each one of those particular points has to completely match yours. And you cannot be mistaken for someone else if your prints don't match theirs. Today, on our journey, we have glided through a brief history of fingerprint analysis. We stopped off and explored how identification works, and then ended our quest by feeling more secure about the identity process. As technology advances further in the future, so will crime. But one thing we can always count on is the use of fingerprint identification to help in this fight.
Jason, what did you think?
I liked the grabber. It got my attention. The structure, I understood exactly what she was coming across. She had a nice flow between the transitionals. One thing I liked the images and explained them well. One thing I've noticed though was that you're reading more from the script and not enough to the audience. Yeah. And that's pretty much it.
All right, well, I like the opening section quite well. I do think that if you delivered it more to us and less reading, that it would work a little bit more effectively. I thought you had a very clear statement of what your goal was for the presentation. You gave a little bit of personal justification for talking about it. The preview was a little confusing to me because it sounded actually like you had two previews in the speech. There's one section where you start talking about how this is being used. There's the history stuff, and then there's another section where you're going to be talking about the fingerprints themselves. And I thought it was not as clear that that's a subsection of one of the first points. It sounds almost like it's going to be its own speech, and I think that that's a little disconcerting. I do think you need to cite the material a little bit more. The example of the William West case, for instance, I know comes from someplace. The details that you had in your forensics course you've put into the presentation, I think, pretty well. Don't forget to cite where the standard is from, you know, how you count the ridges out, what the definitions of the individual parts are. I did think that it was interesting as soon as you started explaining the different kinds of fingerprints, I saw at least half the class look at their fingers and start to check and see, so what kind do I have? And it seems to me like there's an opportunity for you to involve the audience a little bit more when you're talking. You say, okay, well, you can look and see if you've got, you know, an arch, a whorl, or
my throat gets really
the other one, you know. So it's one of those things where I think you kind of miss the opportunity there. But it's pretty well organized when you're going through the speech, and you've got very good signposting. The visuals, I think, are pretty effective. The image of the two guys that are identified as being the same person, I thought that was pretty compelling.